We're living in the timeline where Sonic the Hedgehog of all franchises has one of the better live-action video game adaptations. And at a bare glance, this is one of the most overqualified casts I have ever seen. You have Keanu Reeves as Shadow, Idris Elba as Knuckles, and Jim Carrey as Eggman, and they're all wrapped up in a single film. And this franchise has been firing on all cylinders across multiple mediums. There are multiple Sonic cartoons, and some of them are airing right now that I've heard are pretty good. He has a well-regarded comic series, and now a full-on film trilogy that is pretty dang good. And this is truly shocking considering that a lot of Sonic's 3D games have been hit or miss for years. You would almost assume that the games are the spin-off series, and Sonic 3 is an overall adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2, but it subverts the formula in a good way that also satisfies fans. And this is a core detail here because most of the time when you hear about a writer subverting your expectations, it's usually because they despise the franchise that they've been hired to work on and they think they can do it better. But this time around, it kind of feels like the writers are actually having fun with the source material and playing around with different concepts. We saw this in Sonic the Hedgehog 2, where Eggman had a super form. You know, most of the time in the games, Eggman usually just jams the Chaos Emeralds in a robot and just calls it a day, but no, in the second movie, he actually uses them and powers up Dragon Ball Z style, and it's hilarious, but it's a funny idea that I've never seen them use in the games. And the writers kind of ride this fine line of keeping the core of Sonic Adventure's story intact while also adapting it to the live-action series. And keep in mind, while the films have Sonic characters, they're a bit different than how they behave in the games. Like, Sonic is a lot younger in the movies, and he focuses more on his humor and being a wisecracking smartass. And Eggman is kind of a vehicle for Jim Carrey's antics. And I just like to point out that Jim Carrey's impression of Dr. Robotnik is kind of one of the reasons why these movies work so good, because at the end of the day, the Sonic movies aren't just about the cartoon hedgehog, it's also about the cartoon human that is Jim Carrey. And he blends in so well with this setup because the writers and the directors have a delicate task at hand. They have to manage having both live-action human beings interact with 3D cartoon characters. And Jim Carrey kind of serves as this middle ground because he's so animated the way he behaves. Like, you'll never find another human being like him that he can kind of bridge that gap between real life human beings and cartoon characters. He blends the two art styles together. And while I have followed these movies, it kind of seems like this time around in Sonic 3 that Jim Carrey's Dr. Robotnik is actually starting to feel more like he is in the games. And this time around, Jim Carrey seriously ups his game by playing two Dr. Eggmans. In the live-action universe of Sonic the Hedgehog, Gerald Robotnik is alive, and he's the primary antagonist. Now, this was probably done to get the most out of having Jim Carrey on board for a third time, but it also works in the context of this live-action universe. And this is definitely a subversion, because remember, Gerald Robotnik in the games was never implied to be evil. He always had noble intentions, and he was always trying to heal his daughter. But in the films, it works, because the overall theme of this movie is that revenge is just not worth it at the end of the day. Shadow is meant to be a mirror image to Sonic of what happens when you go mad with revenge, and Gerald is meant to mirror image Ivo Robotnik of what happens when you take things too far. Sonic in the film struggles to keep up with Shadow. Shadow is older and more experienced with military training, and he usually bests him in one-on-one combat. And Ivo struggles to keep up with Gerald Robotnik, who has years of scientific knowledge behind them. But ultimately, both Sonic and Ivo end up prevailing because they acknowledge their friends and they find a way to win. It's basic stuff, but you got to keep in mind, this is a kid's movie, and simple messages are okay in this context. Now, when it comes to Shadow's backstory, the core aspects and all the story beats are all left intact, but it's definitely been tweaked for live action. And Shadow's backstory definitely works in this context. I kind of feel like His backstory is very comic booky, something that modern audiences are pretty well accustomed to, where he's an alien from space and he gets experimented by the government. And that's kind of a familiar tone and pacing that we're used to. Now, what has changed is that, as far as we can tell, Dark Doom and the aliens haven't been showcased here, because that would make for one mess of a script. They do leave it kind of open in that he crash lands in the Earth from a comet and he doesn't know where he comes from, so they might be leaving that open-ended for some type of sequel or spin-off. But as far as we know, Dark Doom isn't a thing here, and everything takes place on Earth, which is good for the live action universe. You have to keep in mind that the technology here isn't as advanced as is in the games, and everything's just a bit more grounded. Maria this time around is just a regular kid. She doesn't have any sort of terminal illness, and she kind of just befriends Shadow. It all kind of plays out like a Saturday morning cartoon or an 80s movie, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of E.T., and it just works. It just works seeing that this regular kid behave like a kid. It makes it more endearing and relatable to the audience. Now, she does end up dying at the hands of Gunn, but it plays out in a more PG-13 kind of way. And all in all, this is kind of how you adapt a story to the big screen. You change what is necessary to fit in with the scope of your project, but you keep the core story beats intact here. Those core story beats are simple. Shadow is basically a comic book character. He is a superhero that is a genetic experiment. He has a friendship with a human character that is Maria, and she ends up dying at the hands of an evil government conspiracy that is Gunn, and this forces Shadow to go on a quest for revenge. Pretty simple, and that's all you really needed to do here. Another big change to the live action universe is that it cut out a lot of filler from the games. We're mostly laser focused this time around between the rivalry between Sonic and Shadow and the two Eggmans. The plot ignores a lot of Sonic friends, which is for the better. You know, a lot of 3D Sonic games, Sonic Adventure 2 included, are chock full of filler due to Sonic levels going by way too fast. And this isn't just an opinion of mine. Look up any playthrough of all the speed stages in Sonic Adventure 2, and they're like 40 minutes tops. And that's not like a speed run or anything, that's just generic run-of-the-mill gameplay. And this is because the speed stages are a huge resource hog in development, and they go by really quickly in gameplay. So Sega often has to pad the game out to fit a full price release. And to cut out all that needless filler from the games, like we don't need to see Knuckles looking around for Chaos Emerald shards, is a huge relief this time around. And speaking of things that were completely cut from this movie, there is no BioLizard this time around, and I think it's for the better. For them to include the BioLizard, it would just make this a mess of a script. And in my opinion, to tell you the truth, I always kind of thought that the BioLizard was always this kind of half-assed final boss fight. I kind of feel like Sega was just trying to one-up the final boss from their previous game, except it really didn't land as well. Throughout the entire duration of Sonic Adventure 1, you fight Chaos and his multiple forms, and they're all pretty well designed. And it all leads up to the final confrontation with Perfect Chaos. And Perfect Chaos is based off of a Godzilla monster, so it just looks cool and it works. The BioLizard just kind of comes out of nowhere, and he's just a generic MacGuffin for Sonic and Shadow to team up against. Cutting it out of the movie means that the script can focus on the main rivalry in this film, and that's between Sonic and Shadow. Instead of fighting a giant lizard, the movie treats us to a Dragon Ball Z fight between Super Sonic and Super Shadow, and it just lands better. So overall, what are my final thoughts of Sonic 3, the movie? I would say that this is probably the most tightly and well executed scripts of all the movies. They cut out a lot of fat this time around, while still being a faithful adaptation to the games. They kept Shadow's backstory mostly intact, in that he's an alien from space, and he was captured by Gunn, and he was experimented upon. He had that relationship with Maria that ultimately ended up in her dying, and him going on a quest for revenge. So they kept a lot back intact here. and that was good. I also loved the changes that they made. I like the idea of just having two Eggmans at once. That just worked out for the better. Jim Carrey was on a roll throughout the entire duration of this film, and I overall liked the pacing. There's definitely, by focusing on the rivalry between Sonic and Shadow, they can craft a narrative that is more tightly focused on why revenge is bad and ultimately why you need to stick by your friends. And that works because at the end of the day, this is a kids movie and it's a message that lands pretty well with kids. So overall, yeah, Sonic 3 was a good adaptation that subverted your expectations, but they did it in a good way. Isn't that a nice change for once in a while? I'm the Gaming Grappler. If you stuck with me this long, then I think you owe me a nice like, comment, and subscribe. And with that being said, I'll see you next time. I'll try to deliver you content on a consistent and regular basis. Have a good one, everybody.